What's up, everybody? It is me, Eric Trexler. You are listening to Iron Culture. I am joined by the Dr. Eric Helms. Helms, how are we doing tonight?
I am baffled that you still don't understand that it is not tonight here. Just before we started recording, I mentioned that I was drinking Pepsi Max and I'd be wired all night, forgetting that it is still the morning here in New Zealand.
Are you guys still doing that internationally? You haven't started using American time as your default time?
No, and also there's no such thing as American time. There's actually, I think, what, four time zones? Central. No. If you include Hawaii, you got five, maybe six with Alaska.
Well, New York is the financial capital of the world. And so I think that's kind of America time, right?
Oh, let's just be clear. You just stated that New York time, not even Eastern Standard Time, should be the time for all of the U.S.
Right.
I think you have probably just alienated everyone as a coastal elite, which is surprising considering you're just a southern boy from North Carolina.
Listen, I know how the bread gets buttered. I see all the trading and the cultivation of wealth happening in New York, keeping the global economy humming along. And so if they tell me it's 2 p.m. in the afternoon, I'm inclined to agree with them.
Hey, well, I'm good with that as long as you can take the heat from being a coastal elite. Then I'm fine with it.
Yeah, I'm prepared for that. All right, Helms. We have, let's see, we've had a streak here where we've done some pre-recorded episodes, some crossover episodes, some deep dive episodes, but something we've been lacking on lately has been Q&As, which back before we merged Mass Office Hours with Iron Culture to bring you Iron Culture presented by the Mass Research Review. Before we did that, we had a whole podcast that was just live Q&As, and so we have fallen behind on our database of questions that people are constantly submitting. You go over to massresearchreview.com/ironculture, and that's where you can submit those questions for our portal. So we have a lot to cover. We got some great questions that have come in today's episode, Helms, we are going to finally give some love to the question portal.
Let's do it.
Any other updates you want to give the people before we dive in?
Yeah. So speaking of those awesome episodes, they're still happening too. We've got one lined up with, God, now I would consider an IPF legend, Kjell Backlund, who recently surprised everyone by dropping down a weight class again, and further kicking that can down the road on the 66 kilo classic world record, totaling, I think, 782 or something bonkers like that. I want to talk to him about how he's basically dieting down to stage condition and managing to get, still put numbers on that record, which is just really, really impressive. So that's coming up. Also, we had Connor Heffernan on talking about his new book. That book came in the mail, so I'm really excited to start actually digging into when fitness went global. And we've got more of the crossover episodes with Steve Hall, and we've landed on a name, Trex. They're going to be Stronger Culture. So that's coming out soon. That's going to be exciting. Just a big shout out to everybody. Thank you to everyone who is following along, is subscribes to Mass. Check that out. That is exactly what we do to, as you said, keep the bread buttered, just like New York does for the U.S. And also make sure that you head over to our buddies over at Elite FTS. Shout out Dave Tate, who give us a fabulous deal with the code MRR10. That's Mass Research Review 10. Just enter MRR10 at checkout, and you can get 10% off all of their awesome lifting gear, which will last you so long that it's a surprise. Their business model still works. If you want more of these Q&A episodes, please stick around, and also please keep submitting questions, and please do like, subscribe, and if you're listening on our podcast feed, also give us high ratings. So I think that probably covers all our dotted I's, crossed T's, disclaimers, and financial obligations to the powers that be, and we can get into these Q's with some A's.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. So Helms, our first question here. By the way, congrats to Connor, an actual book printed in the flesh. Very classy, very established there. And what was it called? How the Globalists Took Over Fitness?
Yes, and
Yes.
with a solid nod to what we can do about it to militarize our own self to free us from the
Yeah.
globalists.
I believe Alex Jones wrote the introduction. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the forward, and actually the whole book.
Yes.
I think I got sent the wrong one.
Ah, no, that was just the one you ordered on Amazon. Yeah.
Correct. So
Yeah.
okay, maybe that's coming. But what you want to get is When Fitness Went Global by Connor Heffernan.
There you go.
Yeah,
Perfect. All right. So, Helms, let's start out with the culture side of iron culture.
let's do it.
Okay. So, we got a question from Robin. Robin says, I've seen a lot of gatekeeping on social media about what constitutes a bodybuilder versus a person who competes in bodybuilding. And this is a tale as old as time, Helms. This goes back. I remember people who would call themselves a bodybuilder. Why did they do it? Because, Helms, it was 2009. They carried Tupperware everywhere. They wore a stringer in the gym. They lifted 7 days a week. Everything they did, they lived and breathed the bodybuilding lifestyle, and yet not one drop of tanner had ever touched their body, not one razor on the forearm. They had never actually contemplated the idea of competing in the sport we call bodybuilding. So, Helms, how do you feel about this term bodybuilder and it being utilized by people who do not participate in the sport properly or technically speaking?
I feel great about it, and I think I'm all about drawing larger circles versus, borders, in my opinion. I think, however, it's very important to make distinction between what makes sense for competitive bodybuilders or bodybuilding, because many of the things that competitive bodybuilders do really should not be done or recommended and are frankly counterproductive to what people do in quote unquote bodybuilding. And I think, if anything, this actually, some people, I've talked about the debate between whether bodybuilding is a sport or not, but this is actually quite true when you look at sports generally. When you make them competitive, many of these activities, which are also games, or maybe they're always sports, but they're done in different contexts, should be done differently. Like, I think some of the things that would be decided by a sports medicine doctor in, say, the final quarter of a professional team sport game where millions of dollars on the line, like, I don't know, let's just cut off that finger, or let's make some interesting decisions in the off season, would be different than the fourth quarter of, say, the Pee Wee League football game, and they should be, right? So professional sport, and even sport at the highest level in the quote unquote amateurs for Olympics, is very different than community sport. And what sport attempts to accomplish in its role, its beneficial impact in society in youth sport, should be and is very different than what it is at the highest level in elite sport performance. And the same thing is true in quote unquote the broader circle of bodybuilding versus competitive bodybuilding. So there's a reason why we make a distinction between, I'm an enhanced bodybuilder, I'm a natural bodybuilder, I'm a competitive bodybuilder. I compete in a specific division under the umbrella of competitive bodybuilding or physique sport, and I am just someone who participates in the culture of bodybuilding. I see them all as my brothers and sisters in iron. And I just think it's important for us to make those distinctions so that I can give good recommendations and that what is an artifact of the requirements. So, for example, simple stuff from, I don't really need to bulk and cut. I can just kind of focus on gaintaining, recomping, and I shouldn't get that lean, to, logistical stuff like, maybe I don't need to consider, freaking tanner or all those fun things. And so I think it's important, but I don't think people should be gatekeeping the term broadly. I mean, people are going to do what they want. They're not just going to listen to Helms. But as someone who's done 20 shows, I am very comfortable calling people who don't compete bodybuilders if they are culturally identifying as bodybuilders.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how my views used to be on this. I can't even begin to place myself back in my mentality through the years dating back to like 2006 when I started getting into fitness as a teenager, which, by the way, if I had it my way, I'd go back and make sure that as a teenager, I was just simply not allowed to have thoughts. I think that's probably the best way to do it, but I can't figure out a way to go back and make that happen. So I'm sure at some point in my time, I felt like there was some really hardcore thing where no, you have to compete to earn the title. But I completely agree with you. I don't think there's much utility in trying to safeguard the title. I don't think as many people are fighting over that title as you think, bodybuilders. And I also think when you have, this kind of like tiny niche subculture, it can be really nice to expand it out a little bit and bring more people into the fold. I think it's fun when your little niche hobby actually like doesn't become totally mainstream, but has its moment and kind of breaks out and gets a little bit more momentum behind it. Nice things happen when you start building a little bit more momentum for any particular endeavor. A lot of times there's more access, more attention, and things like that.
If I may, Trex, I think we've seen that occur in powerlifting, which, by the way, for those who aren't paying attention, Powerlifting America Nationals are coming up in just, I think, a week or two. And they are going to have probably the most impressive 93 kilo battle of all time going down. But nonetheless, the reason why I bring that up is that things like Sheffield, Avansis, other sponsored money meets like Girl Power or Silent Worker, these would not be in existence if it wasn't for that broadening of the circle of powerlifting. And because of various reasons, fitness growing, CrossFit, and some people going, I like these aspects of it, but not others, and barbells getting into the hands of more people, us understanding that it's safe for youth lifters to be lifting weights, doing squat, bench, and deadlift, and the general exposure. Powerlifting, frankly, without that, is really hard to watch. You can't even tell if you're looking at 3 reds, 4 reds, or 5 reds unless you have pretty good eyesight and the stream quality's high and the camera's close. So if you don't actually lift weights, looking at someone squatting 220 or 270, or closer to, that's, by the way, in freedom units, like close to 500 and close to 600 pounds, those don't mean anything to you unless you are a quote-unquote powerlifter, even if you've never been on the platform. If you squat, bench, and deadlift regularly and you want to get stronger, man, it's pretty cool to watch powerlifting. And one experience we had to kind of show how this applies to bodybuilding, we polled our YouTube audience one time, Trex at 3DMJ, and we have a pretty consistent brand, right? And there's pictures of the coaches mostly naked in, Speedos, and we've had things like 100% natural bodybuilding as our tagline with somebody flexing on stage. And we're very well known as coaches for natural bodybuilding. You'd think we'd have a crazy niche audience. 70% of our YouTube subscribers were not competing and had no intention of competing, but they were fans of natural bodybuilding, probably because they identified as bodybuilders, don't use anabolics, appreciate health, performance, and also the aesthetics and the artistry of bodybuilding, which, are all facets that people can opt in or out of depending upon which aspects of bodybuilding they like, and that's why there are YouTube subscribers. So it would be foolish of us to really kind of slap all those people in the face and say, no, you're not part of our tribe. So I think it's a big mistake, and I think for anyone who feels othered by those types of comments online, remember that it has much more to do with the person saying it wanting to feel unique, hence why teenagers should not be allowed thoughts. And even people who compete in bodybuilding up through probably their 20s, because, we haven't really evolved much past that, at least I didn't. But, there's a lot of people who are looking for validation in what they do, and they haven't fully generated a self-concept, and these are very loud voices on social media. See Trex's last episode where we talked about who posters are and histrionic traits and grandiose narcissism and all that good stuff. It has very little to do with them actually wanting you not to be a part of it, but them wanting you to see them as special and unique. And I think just kind of in your mind, pat them on the head and say you are accepted and loved, rather than seeing it as they don't want to accept you, because that probably has very little to do with it.
Yep. Good stuff. All right, Helms, there's a nasty rumor going around in the live chat on YouTube that we are only taking questions from the after hours portal and not the live chat. So purely out of spite, I'm going to throw you a question from the live chat. The question is, when it comes to diminishing returns in terms of the effect of protein on muscle protein synthesis, when do those diminishing returns get so small that the juice simply isn't worth the squeeze anymore. So it's not clear if they mean protein per meal or protein per day, but let's go protein per day, I would say.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I guess it comes down to like effect size interpretation and translating that into practical terms, and then even translating changes in fat-free mass into actual skeletal muscle mass changes that we think over time. So it's a bit ambiguous, but I think if I recall correctly, and also sorry, it also depends upon the state and the condition you're in. So the range of recommended protein intakes that we would have for a lean person dieting would probably be quite different than someone in a moderate or quote unquote high but still healthy body fat in a surplus, right? And that's why, our meta-regression led by Dr. Refalo differs a bit from what I think is the most recent data by Nunez and colleagues, which our colleague Dr. Lauren Clenzo Semple was a part of, that is actually being reanalyzed currently by Dr. James Steele. So do take a look at that when it comes out, probably later this year. But if you look at kind of the point at where the 95% uncertainty starts to plateau in the Nunez and colleagues surplus data, looking only at those who lifted weights, it starts to plateau somewhere broadly between what I would say is like 1.5 or 6 all the way up to somewhere around 2.2 maybe, somewhere in that range. And the question is where does, I mean, you could even maybe argue slightly greater than that is where it plateaus. But the question is where do the diminishing returns stop mattering? And that's different. So I would argue that I think there may be a true functional plateau that I'd be very confident in, somewhere around 2.5 grams per kilogram in a surplus. But I would also argue that I think if you compared 2.5 to, say, 1.8, you probably would not be able to tell any difference over the time scale of 6 months, if I had to guess, to contextualize this in some way. If we try to convert those effect sizes into actual changes in lean body mass, these studies are half to a third of that length, and when you look at, half a gram per kilogram of protein differences, we're looking at what would be like a quarter of a trivial effect size. And then if we think about the effect of lifting weights over that same time period, we're looking at something that's, 4 or 5 times that. So all of that in my head says you might be able, with a discerning eye and the ability to travel between two parallel universes of yourself, look at, okay, for 6 months I consumed 1.6, or for 6 months I consumed 2.5. Everything else was the same, and I am an intermediate. I think I look slightly better in that world right at 2.5. I think that's the point where you might be able to see something. In a deficit, based upon our data, I would say you could just bump those two numbers up by about 0.3 or 0.4, and I'm comfortable with saying similar.
Yeah. Now, there's a couple other questions about protein in the after hours portal. One was kind of looking at the flip side, and they were like, hey, is there any disadvantage to eating too much protein? I basically weigh about 162. I find myself generally eating 1.2 grams per pound, mostly just due to preference, eating over 200 grams of protein a day. Would it be better for them from a muscle growth perspective to try to aim a little bit lower so they can get more fats, carbs, and fiber? Or should they keep trucking along, doing their thing?
So here's the thing, is I think an interesting anecdote, which we're actually going to be talking about in one of Zerdos' articles in the future, in Mass, coming up in a couple months, is that a lot of the times the anecdotal experiences conflict with the data, not because one or the other is wrong or misrepresented, but anecdotes are reflecting a quote-unquote complex intervention, while data reflect a specific analysis in a controlled environment, and sometimes even a statistically reductionist way that can't be represented even in the trials themselves, where we've actually controlled for things and used statistical methods to adjust, right? So what I'm getting at is that there are many coaches in the bodybuilding world who I do believe have observed positive outcomes holistically from being above the protein recommendations that would have a positive, direct, even theoretical benefit for muscle. I wrote about an aspect of this in Mass where I compared two different diets. One that was at a reasonable kind of protein intake, but still evidence based, of say 1.6 grams per kilogram, and a reasonable fiber intake around 30 grams, to something that was twice that in both cases. So doubling that fiber intake, doubling that protein intake, which is not at all unheard of in the bodybuilding world, although it might be like, say, a standard deviation above the norm. But if we're talking about a clean eating, hardcore bodybuilder, and also compared that to your typical American diet, which is closer to like 10 to 15 grams of fiber and maybe 1.1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of protein per day. And then additionally looking at differences in food sources to where you're going to be getting other things in the diet that are typically associated with a bodybuilding lifestyle that even intentionally could be leveraged, like semi-digestible carbohydrate sources, and other aspects which either increase daily energy expenditure through TEF or actually prevent the full absorption of some of the calories in your diet. And as you go through those three steps, if you take your typical kind of average intake of someone who's 2,500 calories, you're looking at a roughly 100 to 200 calorie difference in metabolizable energy slash net surplus or deficit, wherever you're at, as you move through each one of those. So if you compare someone who is on the typical American diet, but on paper is eating the same amount of calories, but they almost triple their protein, they quadruple their fiber, and they shift their diet around to select more foods of that nature that I described earlier, semi-digestible starches, let's say whole almonds, other things that have aspects of them which prevent the absorption of certain macronutrients and essentially calories, what you're going to find is about a 300 calorie disparity. And in the modern environment where food noise is high, activity is low, and people are struggling just in a day-to-day basis when they're not even trying to be in a quote-unquote bulking phase to not exceed the recommended rates of weight gain that we suggest for a trained lifter, that can actually help with body recomposition and outcomes. Anything that kind of enhances satiety, increases energy expenditure, and reduces kind of the overall unintended net surplus tends to look like, in our experience as coaches, better adherence, and better body composition or recomposition outcomes. So now what you're actually seeing as a coach is I ask them to increase their protein and I ask them to eat more fruits and vegetables. And the consequence was, better body composition outcomes than I saw previously with them because we're looking at pictures and body weight, right? So I think if you isolated that in a lab, it wouldn't be probably, or even primarily, even if it was a small impact, related to the protein intake impacting muscle protein synthesis. It would be related to net energy balance and behavior. So that, I think, is a pretty large caveat. So first, there is no indication of harm in non-clinical healthy populations that going even as high as like 4 grams per kilogram or close to 2 grams per pound is harmful for health from a protein perspective. And assuming that the person has an adequate total daily energy expenditure that allows a sufficient diet that is complete in micronutrients and other macronutrients while consuming a very high protein diet, then there's no issue there, because if you hold calories constant and increase protein, that's got to come from somewhere, a reduction in fat or carbohydrate, then this is totally fine. The logistical issues come when someone does not have those prerequisites met. So more common in dieting. So for example, when you get someone who, for whatever reason, has a low total daily energy expenditure, but a high training load, a high body mass, and has extreme goals, which I'm represented by, it's very difficult for me, for example, to be consuming in a caloric deficit close to 3 grams per kilogram or 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 grams per pound for the Americans in protein without it also forcing my fats down or my carbohydrates down, or me going out there and intentionally getting an amount of steps and cardio that really doesn't match my lifestyle. And that actually feels excessive just because of whatever the nature of my, metabolism and non-exercise spontaneous activity does. So is it smart for me to go to that high, even if it could be beneficial in one of these direct or indirect ways? No, I'm probably going to stay around 2.7, 2.6, maybe 2.8, and then have a higher carbohydrate and fat intake. But there are many people who are just furnaces, for lack of a better description, who, yeah, like I was actually just talking to a female bodybuilder friend of mine who she literally weighs 80 pounds less than me and is in a similar surplus size, eating just 300 calories less than me. So if you ask her to constrain her protein intake even to 3 grams per kilogram, because she weighs like 51, like, can you imagine a diet that's only 150 grams of protein while you're consuming 2,700 calories? Like, you can do it, that's no problem. But the natural thing of the quote unquote bodybuilding lifestyle, if you're in the 2,500 to 3,000 calorie range, is you're probably going to be closer to 200 grams of protein.
Yeah.
So, is that a problem? Not at all.
All right. Good stuff. Now, on the topic of protein, one last one here. Someone was asking if there's a theoretical point where the amount of protein you're consuming from high soy isoflavone sources like TVP becomes concerning as far as estrogenic effects go. So this is an individual who's eating a high protein diet, getting a lot of it from soy-based sources, and is wondering, is there a level or a limit where you think they should be worried about that?
I would say functionally no, based upon the data as it's emerged. The concerns we had of that in the mid 2000s, even the 20 aughts, into say 2012, 2013, were largely mechanistic in nature or observational, or I think some animal model data as well, if I recall correctly. But there has been quite literally no good data and a diminished kind of validation, so a lack of validation of those early works when we look at populations that consume more and more and more and more soy as far as any kind of negative effect. And I'm also not even convinced of those mechanistic links because they were one step away from actually a negative outcome. They were saying, hey, this could have a measurable impact on estrogen levels in men, but the magnitude was then just assumed because kind of back in those days, it was also when like 6-oxo and other anti-estrogens were making their way into the supplement line. It was seen as, oh, estrogen lower equals good for muscle and fat. But I would say that's actually relatively challenged now. And even if you talk to like people in the enhanced community, they think that some degree of estrogen, so long as it doesn't get out of hand, and getting higher estrogen levels during your steroid protocol is actually conducive to recovery and muscle growth. And you want to push it as high as you can without side effects, which is just a different way that even the enhanced community was looking at this compared to now. And if you ever talk to a enhanced bodybuilder who during that era went way too hard on anti-estrogens, they'll tell you it was a really bad experience. They had really achy joints, they felt terrible, it impacted mood, and they actually tend to do better when they have slightly more quote-unquote androgenic drugs, which have more aromatization. You know, assuming you don't take it too far and get gynecomastia or other side effects. So anyway,
Yeah.
all that is to say, let's say that it was true that you consumed enough soy for those isoflavones to actually have a very small increase in estrogen. I'm not convinced it would be a bad thing. It could even be positive, but I suspect it would be within a range that is neutral. It wouldn't have any real notable impact.
Yeah, like you said, the mechanistic stuff never really drove it all the way home, where they basically said, here's the magnitude of increase we could see. Here's us showing, compared to, comparative affinity for receptor binding, when these bind with the receptor rather than, genuine endogenous estrogen, do they have the same potency or same intracellular effects? There's a lot missing in that kind of causal chain. And, I would say the strongest evidence, with a huge air quotes around that because it's not strong evidence, would be there's like 1 or 2 case reports of somebody who like lives off of soy milk and came in with like low test, high estrogen. And they're like, well, I guess it was the milk, So yeah, it definitely blown out of proportion. And the higher you get up that hierarchy of evidence, the less concerning the data look, which is always good for you. Yeah.
Yeah, well said. I've got a question for you because I haven't looked at this probably in 6 years.
Yes.
There were some trials which had made it up that hierarchy of evidence that were specifically on sperm quality, quantity, and health. I think I knew of 2 studies which did show. I'm not sure if they're clinically meaningful. Like if you were to go to actually like a fertility clinic, where high soy intakes were associated with slightly lower markers for sperm quality and quantity, but they weren't big trials by any means. They weren't like meta-analyses of RCTs. Have you looked into that at all in the last like half decade?
Um, I think that right now the consensus is that effects on sperm quality and quantity is considered to be negligible. But I would have to do a little bit more digging on that. That is the last I heard. But we can potentially look into it and see if we can provide an update. Does that sound fair to you?
I think so. Yeah, that's maybe something we can earmark for the future. But I do recall, even in the studies I looked at, there were not enough for me, even in I think 2018 or 2017 when I made that content, to dismiss it entirely, but also not for me to be truly concerned. It's more like one of those things. It's like, if I'm going to be a responsible content creator, I have to mention this,
Yeah. So
right?
what I'm going to do is I'm going to fact check that on the fly while I hand you the microphone, pass it to
Let's do it.
you. You, in the course of one of your prior answers, you alluded to the concept that throughout your day to day life, there are occasions where you ambulate. Is that true?
Mm-hmm.
Would you acknowledge that? You take
Yeah, I mean, just a
steps.
second ago, I
Yeah.
did walk to plug in my laptop.
So,
Yep.
but you alluded to the concept of ambulation and acknowledged in your own words being a participant in that activity. And
Mm-hmm.
theoretically, those steps that you complete could be counted. And
Yes.
I want to give you an opportunity. It seems like there's been some game of telephone, some miscommunication somewhere along the line where people have gotten the impression that Eric Helms, the good doctor, PhD, has determined that 17,000 steps a day is the maximum a human person can take. Anything above it is inappropriate and can no longer be counted beyond that threshold. So there seems to be some miscommunication, some game of telephone going on regarding you and your recommendations in terms of, I guess, upper limits for step counts, where it becomes excessive. And it's relevant because we did have a couple folks who submitted questions where they basically said, like, hey, I take 25,000 steps a day, or in one case, even I take 30,000 steps a day, and this doesn't seem sustainable. To which you and I both internally replied, "That's not, in the vast majority of cases, right?"
Yeah.
So I want to give you the floor to address the game of telephone regarding you and step counts, what you think is feasible, how you typically advise people when they decide it's time to manipulate step counts as a variable. And while you're doing that, I'm going to look at what else? Soy intake and sperm counts.
Perfect. Yeah, so first we're just going to clear the record. I have never written nor said, except in response to someone claiming that I have written or said this, anything related to the number 17 or 17,500 steps. And I do believe that this question stemmed from exactly one person on Instagram who I then responded to, and then other people saw it and assumed that I did say it when I never actually said it or wrote it. And it was a direct relation to the muscle and strength pyramids. And specifically in those books, I said, hey, here is where you start to get the most return on investment as far as metabolic health, all cause mortality, as well as energy regulation in terms of matching expenditure to habitual intake when we look at all the data. And that is right around 7,000 steps per day, or 6 to 8 to provide a range and some uncertainty, which is a better reflection of the data. That's probably a good baseline level. So I specifically state that if your normal activity level is below that, work to modify your behavior to get you into that 6 to 8,000 baseline range. Now, this, in addition to resistance training, like 3 or more times per week, is probably going to give you 95, if not 99 to 100% of all the potential beneficial health effects, metabolic effects, all the positive effects you can think of from activity broadly. They're not going to maximize your VO2, or like get you to be an elite endurance athlete by any means, but that is kind of like from a health perspective what I would suggest. Then I also talk about it from the perspective of, should you do active cardio? Should you count steps? And how does this work into fat loss? And I talk about something that you are very well familiar with and you've talked about a lot, is the notion of there being a constrained energy model of total daily energy expenditure, especially when people are in a deficit and especially when they start pushing higher and higher step counts. And that when you leverage activity as a fat loss tool to get into a deficit, it is particularly problematic to try to count that in a linear additive fashion because that's when it's least likely to happen. So I try to give some practical recommendations around that. So the basic recommendation is that if your activity level is already above 1,000 steps per day, 7,000 steps per day, then a decent intentional cap for increasing it is no more than 50% of your baseline. And this has much more to do with what I see when people go from say 5,000 steps to 15 or 20. They often get like arch pain or shin splints or things like that, and it becomes a problem and actually can impact their lifting. Jeff Alberts had this experience when he went from sedentary to I'm going to do a crap ton of steps to play catch up in one of his preps, and he was like, okay, we need to have some kind of limit based upon, or even just a strategy of slowly introducing higher steps over time. So this is a number completely pulled out of my butt, and that's, let's say, a rough ceiling of 15,000 steps per day. If that's an intentional increase to lose weight in a deficit, and all of that is explicitly clear in my books. So I also state that if you're already taking more than 15,000 steps per day, that's fine. If it naturally fits your lifestyle or job, or you like to hike, or you like to take walks, or you just, you're someone who lives in a very walkable location, and your job, your school, your gym, and your partner's house, who you haven't moved in with yet, are all 4 different corners of the city. You might just, without even thinking about it, get 20,000 steps per day. So, for example, and this has changed over time, and we've kind of changed the benchmark in society. If we look at traditional agricultural societies like the Amish, we see that the men and women are typically, and it's different because they play different roles in society, like an actual pioneer pre-industrial farmer might very easily get 25 to 35,000 steps per day. And that's not something I'd go like, hey, you need to stop walking so much. My good Amish farmer, I wouldn't tell him that. But if they were like, hey, for some reason, I want to compete in, Mr. Amish Northeast bodybuilding competition, I want to get shredded. What should I do? I wouldn't be like, well, let's try to get your steps up to 50,000 steps per day. I wouldn't say let's increase your current baseline, by 50%. I would say, you know what? Let's churn a little bit less butter and look at opportunities where we can cut your calories. And that's just basically translated to the modern environment. So, like I said, if you're getting more than 15,000 steps per day, don't even worry about it, but probably don't leverage that further just because of the time commitment on average, the potential arch support issues, etc. And maybe even once we get into the extreme numbers, potential interference effects with your training, as a tool for fat loss. So I want to be explicitly clear about that, even though my books are explicitly clear, and you will not be able to open them and hit Control F and find 17,000 in them or 17,500, at least with the word steps coming after it. But, for context, the reason why is because I talk about doing cardio in my books. And roughly adding 2,500 steps per day to your daily routine will, on average, account for about an extra 100 kcals of daily energy expenditure, accounting for these other factors, which can highly vary. So what that means in practice is if you're a coach or you're doing your own fat loss phase, you can make a decision. I want to cut, 25 grams of carbs. I want to cut 10 grams of fat, or I want to add 2,500 steps to my, my day-to-day practice. And when you think about how many times you can add 2,500 steps to your day-to-day walking before it becomes excessive or too much too fast to cause issues or, cause lifestyle problems from like a coaching perspective, you've only got like 2 or 3 of those, if you're starting with someone in your typical active range, right? So that's where these numbers come from. They're absolutely, I present the data on health and kind of that maximum return on investment, but some, but not all of the meta regressions, as you well know, Trex, suggest that there is, just like volume for hypertrophy, a continuing relationship between reducing all-cause mortality and increasing health markers with steps. But there is a point that is, I think, somewhere around 20,000 steps, where like those functional benefits are really starting to plateau, and they are extremely diminished in terms of the returns. Was that enough time for you to tell me about soy and how well my boys are swimming?
Yes. Unfortunately, though, so I found a good meta-analysis that talks about how neither soy nor isoflavone intake seems to meaningfully impact male reproductive hormones. So covering that part of the conversation, that was from 2021, seems to be our most recent update of the data. When it comes to sperm counts, it looks like things are a bit more mixed. But another curveball I will throw at you is in my process of looking for looking through these mixed findings where some studies show lower sperm counts with soy intake, others not showing that. I will acknowledge a couple extra wrinkles that have to come into play, which is why I probably need a longer lit review for this. Number one, we have to consider the magnitude of sperm count change that actually becomes clinically meaningful, right? Because the one thing that's true about sperm, there's a whole bunch of them hanging around, usually more than enough. So I've seen some very panicky articles about how sperm counts. There's what they call secular trends in lower sperm counts, meaning decade over decade sperm counts seem to be dropping. And of course, everyone wants to know what's happening to our bodies, who is doing this to us, etc. But usually those articles, when they're written very well, they'll also note like, by the way, just because we can detect a change doesn't mean this actually matters. And the magnitude of changes that we're seeing here really shouldn't be impacting the bottom line of actual fertility rates, because there's usually just a tremendous surplus of sperm, such that you have a pretty big buffer. The other complicating factor, Helms, if I may, is that I saw at least one study, a very preliminary study, suggesting that vegan diets led to better sperm counts and quality compared to non-vegan diets. And so with that wrinkle, you'd have to also say, well, we're not really rarely are we actually talking about just I'm an omnivore who just really loves soy. Of course that exists, but more often than not, we're looking at two very different diet patterns that are being compared. Someone who's eating toward the upper limit or kind of beyond the norm of what we see with soy intakes, the vast majority of the time, that's a person on a very plant-based diet, or at least a very plant-forward diet. And so then we'd have to look at the totality of impact of the lifestyle factors and entire dietary pattern and how that would impact things. So that's my quick rundown. Short answer is, I don't know.
And to be honest, I think this is one of those times where you would probably need to actually look at RCTs. And this is something that changes over relatively short periods of time. And I think it is feasible, unlike, say, cardiac death, to look at. Like if you gave people a diet supplemented by soy or not, and then they came from the same population, because it'd be really hard to adjust for all the confounders that are different between someone who is a vegan versus someone who is not. And looking at sperm health and quality, because these are I don't want to repeat what the carnivore crowd says about healthy user bias, but I think it would actually come into play here, because you could also say let's say there is a negative effect of soy. How much is that contributing to the vegan's diet? And then let's also think about the competing negative effect that's probably small of soy on sperm health, with the positive effects of potential weight loss, eating more fruits and vegetables, and all the other things that typically co-vary when someone adopts a vegan diet. So I would be very doubtful that even in a well-controlled epidemiological analysis that you would really be able to prevent any kind of contamination from those effects, when we're actually 2 steps away from looking at the impact of manipulating soy in the diet just on sperm. And, to your point that you brought up in one of your recent articles, and I think you talked about either on Front Page Fitness or Iron Culture, some of the historical trends changing in testosterone have been related to how do we measure testosterone changing systematically.
Yeah.
And I am also not enough of a reproductive specialist to know, have our assays or our ability to check population level sperm counts changed? Because they may or may not have. I don't know. So I think there's many confounders here, but I am pretty confident saying this is possible, but I don't think it's something we should be worrying about.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. I'm going to give myself a little bit of attention here. I've been kicking you a lot of questions. A couple little questions here oriented toward me and my research. Someone asked just kind of what I'm up to in terms of research. The answer is I've actually got like a long list of projects going on that span multiple different focal areas. They are, I would say, more in the general health and metabolism realm, more so than like, you know, nuts and bolts of training programming, nuts and bolts of, you know, dietary adjustment, things like that. So I'm kind of, you know, I'm doing some stuff focused more on like female specific physiology and health. So things related to oral contraceptives. I'm doing some stuff in just kind of like general lifestyle, more public health type things in certain occupational groups. So I've got that going on. Of course, working on a better understanding of metabolic adaptation and the constrained energy model. So I have a few different irons in the fire, several different projects at varying levels. I'm even helping out with a couple more sports medicine oriented groups. One project looking at return to play following a couple types of shoulder surgery. So listen, I'm doing all sorts of stuff over here. As they come out, I will do a better job of alerting the people. My research has kind of drifted from the bread and butter, I would say, of the kind of like, you know, evidence-based fitness community proper. And so that's why I don't necessarily come on here and say like, hey, who wants to talk about modest CRP elevations in response to oral contraceptives? But I will be a little bit more self-promoting in the future when some of these things actually hit. I got to Duke a few years ago and started a bunch of projects, and now they're all finally starting to hit the journals. So I'll let people know, especially when there's things that are super relevant. I did get one question about a recent paper in Current Biology that I published with Herman Poncer. It was 10 years after Herman's kind of main primary paper that people cite, where he kind of formalized, like, here's what seems to be the constrained model, here's what we think is going on. And so it was kind of a 10-year update, which was published just about a month or so ago. And someone asked if I could review it. Here's what I want to say about that paper. Really proud of the paper. I think it's really solid. I think it gives a good, very balanced take on what we know and don't know about the constrained energy expenditure model and exercise energy compensation. Of course, it's, you know, trying to take little bits of data from this study and that study and compile them. Not quite enough meat on the bone to do like a formal meta-analysis, but we did some weighted regressions. And this topic is so divisive. I'm absolutely certain you're going to see people that hate the paper and propose 7 different ways we could have alternatively done the analysis. Some of those will have more veracity than others. It is just infinitely true and always true that when you're talking about combining data from multiple studies in this manner, there's going to be a huge range of potential analyses, of potential different approaches. Some are going to be extremely conservative. Some are going to be extremely liberal. I'm really happy with the approach that we took, but that's not to say it's beyond critique or that it's the only way to do it. So with that in mind, I'm not even going to walk into that trap of argument and tell you this is the exact number of calories that you can expect to compensate. But let me talk directionally, just big picture. What we found is that generally speaking, it does seem that the constrained model works out, particularly in some key scenarios. And I think the big finding from the paper is that, when you're looking at people who are doing dietary restriction and a substantial amount of physical activity, that is where we specifically start to see the constrained model work a lot better than the additive model. Frankly, when there's no element of energy restriction, that's where the debate gets really nasty, and there's a lot of, not nasty, but it's very contentious. It's hotly debated, and certainly the magnitude is much smaller. So the 2 big findings, in my opinion, that are interesting to the Iron Culture audience, number one, the dietary component just looks like a big deal. It looks like the dietary restriction in combination with activity, whether that's because you're putting obese individuals on a diet and an RCT, or because you're a hunter-gatherer who takes 27,000 steps a day and the caloric resources are just very modest. And so that's natural energy restriction by circumstance. So energy restriction played a big role in really augmenting that magnitude of exercise energy compensation, which to me was a very gratifying observation, because that really I've been feeling like that's probably the case for some years now because of all my work on metabolic adaptation. The other thing that was really surprising, we did not have a lot of good resistance training data to go off of, but from what we found, it looked like resistance training was not inducing this kind of exercise energy compensation. Resistance training kind of stuck out, and it looked like the additive model was doing relative, again, very limited resistance training data, but we were not seeing very clear evidence of compensation with resistance training, which leads to a really interesting question or set of questions. Is it possible that we simply don't compensate to resistance training the way we compensate to, you know, longer endurance type training or just like general physical activity, ambulating around and having high step counts? So that's one question. Is it possible that there's something fundamentally different about the stimulus that we don't compensate to it? Or is it possible that we don't have a good enough understanding yet of the actual energy cost of resistance exercise, or the energy cost of adding more fat-free mass because of resistance exercise, right? So for us to try to quantify this, we kind of explain. And again, we had to go out on a limb and kind of call our assumptions here in terms of how we're going to quantify this, how we're going to crunch the numbers. And there will be many critiques to that for sure. But basically, we kind of laid out all our assumptions. Here's how we're going to calculate the energy cost of resistance training. Here's how we're going to account for our expected increase in basal metabolic rate due to hypertrophy that's observed. So we called all those things out using the best available evidence. And those assumptions go into the ability to calculate, how much compensation seems to have occurred. So all that is to say, it could be that resistance training is fundamentally different. It could be that we just don't have a good enough understanding of the true energy cost of the resistance training itself and the added lean mass that accompanies it in most interventions. So it's one of those, I think we kind of answered a question and asked a question. Answering the question is, I think the thing that really provided a lot of clarity is the role of dietary restriction in really augmenting that effect. And the new question is, how does resistance training fit into all this?
Trex, I actually think that makes a ton of sense. So one of the things, I don't know if you've ever read about the challenge of trying to estimate the energy expenditure from resistance training, is that you're essentially like getting a rebate to pay off the energy expenditure later,
Right.
because of the use of anaerobic glycolysis and ATP and the phosphocreatine system. It's much more straightforward to count the energy expenditure up when you're doing pure quote unquote aerobic work, right? Another thing is that resistance training creates muscle damage. And we know this from data that we're concerned about. Like, oh, shoot, the muscle protein synthesis response is probably related to the muscle damage response. So when people are doing progressive overload training, even when they are relatively well trained, maintaining the repeated bout effect and recovering from it, even if you're not growing tissue, that's kind of this potential element that might even differ from, say, anaerobic non-resistance training, and the quote-unquote afterburn that might be minimized there might be just elevated and higher because you are truly doing a level of muscular work that causes damage. And you've even heard nutritionists in team sports talk about this, like with collision and the actual like tissue repair. If you look at energy expenditure in like the wound state, you see a bump in what is often measured as quote unquote BMR, but it's not BMR. It's like your body is trying to heal a stab wound, and sometimes bed rest is not as low as you'd expect it to be, right? So you see this in many other ways, like different physiological clinical states can increase energy expenditure, like when you're dealing with a virus or your immune system is like firing on all cylinders. And I think this also matches what I see anecdotally. And when I talk to clinicians who I think would have very similar experiences compared to me, like when I sit down with sports dietitians, they freak out when I tell them kind of like my normal energy intakes that I deal with in bodybuilding, because they're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. They're lifting weights 5 days a week and doing daily cardio, but they're on that much. No way. They're in, like, that's not enough. And when we talking about the off season, though, like it does make sense. And how often do we hear about these bodybuilders in the off season who their calories are around 4,000, but then at the end of prep they're on like 2,000,
Right.
but they're only 20 pounds lighter? Like it doesn't add up. And I think a really big component of that based upon this data and kind of where is the, you know, the metabolic adaptation and the cracks, if you will, I think it does come from the difference of being in a deficit or not.
Yeah.
And I notice personally myself, like I'm maintaining 13 pounds over stage weight on 3,000 calories right now. And I'm training similarly to how I train in prep, maybe slightly higher volume, but my step counts are 70% of what they were in prep. So if you were to actually just calculate the energy expenditure on a day-to-day basis, it's the same or slightly higher in prep. Yet I'm eating more and maintaining weight, and it's not explained by 13 pounds,
Right.
especially 13 pounds that's mostly fat mass. So what's the difference? The difference is that I'm probably not down regulating nearly as much when I'm in this state
Yeah.
of being in the off season.
Yeah, I do tend to see that a lot of the pushback that we get from people who are like really not into this constrained concept or this exercise energy compensation concept. They are folks who come from in many cases like higher level sport, and they're just like, I can't keep my cyclist fed enough. Like we're burning so many calories, you couldn't even believe it. So this concept has no utility to me. It has no meaning to me. I'm not particularly interested in it, and it doesn't match the thing I experience on a day to day basis. And yet, you have me and Herman's like, doing field work with hunter gatherer groups, being like, how are you guys living on these calories? Like you don't stop moving. And then I'm coming from the bodybuilding world where like if you're eating 2,000 calories during prep, it's like, oh my God. And what are you complaining about, right? As a 180-pound man who by the way exercises 6 days a week. Yeah. So I think the context is really big there. So yeah, I'm excited to see if we can build upon this in future research. I think there's a lot of work to be done in better understanding the resistance training side of the equation. And then, of course, yeah, the more work we can do with dieting plus exercise, the better with some of these energy expenditure measurements. So, yeah, go ahead.
One other question for you related to this, I just remembered another anecdote that I found really interesting. How often have you talked to people on the enhanced side of the fence about their calories during prep compared to natural bodybuilders?
Literally never. What about you?
A fair bit. Not as much obviously as someone hanging out here, but like obviously 3DMJ we only coach natural athletes, so I haven't dealt with this directly, but I rub shoulders with a bunch of people in the broader bodybuilding space and even just individual bodybuilders. And sometimes they're like 5'2" lightweights, like they're not massively on gear, but I talked to a number of competitors that this is the first time I really noticed it, and then I started asking coaches like, hey, okay, you've seen thousands, what have you seen? And a really persistent thing is they're dieting on way higher calories.
Yeah.
So what's going on there, especially when the disparity I've noticed as well. I was talking to an older school masters competitor, and he was very open about his drug use. He actually was still cycling on and off. So that's kind of not a thing at the highest level. So there's a huge difference between an amateur in one division and like a Mr. Olympia competitor. We're talking, same height, 50-pound different stage weight, but they're both on gear, right? So like this is probably dose dependent. But anyway, this guy is in his 60s, same stage weight as me and maybe 5'6". So obviously he's enhanced. I'm 6 foot tall, but he was dieting on like 4,000 calories to get pretty freaking lean.
Man.
And this dude in his 60s, and I was like, "What's going on?" And he was like, "Well, it's about the same as what I eat in the off season, but also like I'm on like I increase my dosages and I grow into my shows a little bit. Like he was only losing like 5 or 10 pounds,
Yeah.
but his like if you look at his pictures, like this huge recomp going on,
Yeah.
and that's actually a relatively common strategy, especially in the less muscular divisions where they're not just kind of always trying to peak their muscle mass." Or guys who haven't yet filled out, even if they are in the open division in the IFBB, to where they increase their drugs, and the process of growing muscle seems to drive fat loss because it's increasing energy expenditure so substantially. And this is something that we have a really tough time measuring, is that the process of actual synthesis of new muscle tissue has some energetic cost to it. We don't necessarily know what that is, but it's increasing the energy outside of the equation to some degree. And I think it's really interesting when you look at some of the mechanistic data, like when you look at short-term substantial energy deprivation, like some studies by Pasiakos and colleagues, you can see that being in an acute energy deficit of, say, like 40% decreases NPS. So that's basic. I mean, that's not your super lean. That's not relative energy deficiency in sport. It's not saying, hey, we're using so many amino acids for energy that there's nothing to drive NPS. There's an energetic break. The body's going, hold on, I don't have the energy to build muscle here, which makes sense from an evolutionary biology perspective. That clamps pretty notably as well if you look at some of the data NPS. So NPS is an energy intensive process. So if you're able to build some of the legit numbers I've seen during a 6 month contest prep is like putting on 10 pounds of muscle, right? So that is something that would occur in the first 6 months of drug-free training for someone who's you know coming in and out of their peak muscularity if they follow this kind of blast cruise in prep process. So it comports as well with that anecdote to where if you create a scenario where you're building muscle despite being in a deficit, the energy expenditure is higher than one would anticipate. So yeah.
Yeah. Now, to what extent do you? Because I know it's very common as well for enhanced competitors to use other drugs that do directly boost, things like thyroid hormone, various thermogenic substances. DNP had its day. I don't know how commonly that's used anymore, but how do you? I think is it clenbuterol that also gets you pretty like you're sweating all the time and stuff like that. But in any case, I've
Yeah.
heard of some of these other compounds that seem to be used in prep that help you. They're very thermogenic in nature. Do you think those are also playing a role?
When they are, they do. And I think, but those from the coaches I talk to, they have a far more predictable and kind of linear effect. Like some of them will describe it as, I'll bring in the ECA stack, ephedrine, caffeine, or potentially Clen, depending upon what they're open to. And Clen is one that people really like, clenbuterol, which is a no longer used, basically asthma thing. Like your typical inhaler probably has albuterol, or maybe that was the last generation of them. But it is a pretty reliable effect of increasing energy expenditure that's about, I think, a third more than caffeine and ephedrine together, which is notable. Like people sometimes even in the pre-ephedrine ban natty world, they would like one of their adjustments would be I'm going to bring in ephedrine. And that was kind of like the equivalent of cutting 100 calories. If you kind of look at the data, it kind of comports with that. So similar reports when I talk to some of these folks. But the particular gentleman, the Masters guy, I think he maybe was running Clen, but his main thing was he was just running testosterone, right? Which is kind of your common entry level thing. So yeah, like those exist, but they're not necessarily used by everyone. But for sure, DNP is a lot less used than people talk about because it's
Yeah.
dangerous. Use of thyroid has risks, but is also quite common. Clen doesn't have acute risks, but the reason why it's not used anymore is actually damages the myocardium. It can actually put like a hole in your heart. So there are some cardiac risks with long-term use, but it was an approved drug and used for a long time. It's just like, this is a higher risk factor, and we need to consider, how much we use of it. But it is an anti-catabolic, so it seems to have, muscle preservation effects, maybe even mildly anabolic, as well as substantial increases in energy expenditure. But probably more comparable to like, you know, pretty solid thermogenics. But it's not like DNP, which is a dose-dependent uncoupling agent, which can literally melt you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the thyroid thing is probably dependent upon how much downregulation are they experiencing, expecting, etc. And you can't go too far with that and what you supplement with. I don't fully understand exogenous thyroid use, but I know that is not always necessarily used. So much more common would be like your typical stack would be for, let's say, an entry level competitor during prep, some type of testosterone, maybe one ancillary, focusing on something that is not androgenic, and then Clen, and that's kind of the prep stack for like
Yeah.
amateur, but definitely enhanced. And I don't think that's enough to explain the disparity in energy expenditure. Like with Clen, I'd be like, all right, it's a 10% higher numbers, right? That'd be my guess.
Yeah. Well, cool. Yeah,
Not 50.
I'm. We may be planning out some studies in the future to get more to the bottom of how much resistance training is actually changing energy expenditure in a longitudinal manner. So we'll see if we're able to pull a study together on that and make it happen. But I think we do need more doubly labeled water work with resistance training and measurements of physical activity, basal metabolic rate, the whole 9 yards. So we'll circle that and see if we can get around to it in the future. Helms, I got one more question from the live chat, if you don't mind. I want to make sure we're giving plenty of love and attention to the live chat. So this is a question. You let me know if you know what they're referring to or not. I've been a little bit disengaged from the internet paper discussions, so I'm going to assume this is very clear to you, more so than to me. But the question is, thoughts on the sub-analysis in that meta-regression regarding reps in reserve / proximity to failure. Apparently, it shows that above intensities of 80% of 1RM, reps in reserve is almost irrelevant for hypertrophy. Does this ring a bell, and do you have feelings and perspectives and beliefs?
Not only does it ring a bell, I know exactly what they're talking about. And shout out to the question asker, because the 80% value is actually from the preprint, not the final version. So this is a deep cut. This fellow right here read the Robinson meta-regression preprint, and they actually, in the final version, changed it from 80 to 90%. And I think that was probably because of one of the statistical adjustments. So in the preprint specifically, one of the sub-analyses in Robinson's meta-regression that Dr. Zach Robinson we've had on, looking at the relationship between RIR and hypertrophy, they found that when they looked at loads of 80% or higher, that there was no longer a notable relationship, and that slope basically got almost completely flat. In the final version, they used over 90%. So my thoughts on that are twofold. One, the heavier you go, you're automatically at a lower RIR. There's no such thing as doing 10 reps with 90% of 1RM. That is by definition not 90% of your 1RM. And if you look at the final version, if you look at the RIR x-axis, it stops at, I think, a 7 RIR. So depending upon the population study and the exercise done, yes, some people can actually do 8 reps with 90% of 1RM if we're talking, let's say, a novice population doing a leg press. I know that sounds crazy to us lifters, like, nah, triple, maybe 5, if it's a machine. But yeah, because people can't express their 2 1RM strength, you take an untrained female who might have slightly more muscular endurance. On average, population, you have them do a 1RM test. Don't do repeated testing. Just kind of have them do it as a 1 pre-test. Absolutely, they might be able to, if they train at 9% of 1RM, do 3 sets of 8. It's not uncommon. So anyway, in the final analysis, they found pretty flat line in that sub-analysis. Huge caveat here that Zach Robinson would be mad at me if I didn't mention, and actually I think you would as well, Trex, is that as soon as we start doing a sub-analysis, we're not just quote-unquote controlling for this value. We are quite literally removing all of the studies that used a lower percentage of 1RM. So we're looking at probably a quarter of the 1,600-ish participants, I think, that were in this specific analysis of hypertrophy related to RIR, not strength, which was were in there. So we're looking at a relationship in 400 or 500 people, probably, maybe across a collective of, I would say, maybe 10, 11 studies, which is good. But it's not a 1,600 person meta-analysis on close to 36 studies, if I recall correctly. So I think that could be just a lack of precision and insufficient data on this. But I think it's very plausible that it's just simply we're looking at studies that are already beginning at a 2 to 4 RIR in general. And when you look at that plot, there's very little difference between RIR values that are close to one another. And the overall take we can have is that generally being closer to failure is probably better. But almost never in individual studies, so reference Dr. Martin Refalo's PhD work, do we see differences in from like 1 to 2 RIR to 0 RIR actual momentary failure. You can see it when you pump up that statistical power and you include all these other studies, but they are estimations. Like there's very few studies that actually just compare experimentally an RIR versus failure condition. Most of the data in Robinson's meta-regression is actually extrapolated RIR at the group level from percentage 1RM rep combinations or from velocity combinations and velocity loss, which I think is great. And I do think that the greater amount of data overcomes any limitations of those individual studies. But the main take home from that meta regression should be closer to failure, likely slightly better for hypertrophy. But then if you really zero in to where people are exclusively training in almost every study, the 2 to 4 RIR range and a couple of outliers outside of that, it's going to be very difficult with a quarter of the sample to tell the difference. So it could all just be stats. There's also the muscle physiology explanation, though. And that is that above, when we look at EMG data, which is not a proxy for motor unit recruitment, but if we think about how it operates, the way we produce force is by increasing the number of motor units we recruit. However, on our best understanding of the literature right now and muscle physiology, once you get to around 80 to 90% of 1RM or MVC, maximal voluntary contraction, you don't see higher levels of motor unit recruitment because everything's already being recruited. And there are other factors which explain increases in force production, most likely what's called rate coding, or just the firing frequency of those motor units. So they start being recruited in a faster amount, and that twitch summates to a higher force production. So we need more data on this, and there may be people like an Andrew Vygotsky who'd be like, actually, Eric, that's kind of like the 2019 version of it, so I could be wrong. But what that tells me is that above certain load thresholds, you are probably getting similar recruitment of the tissue, similar levels of tension on a per fiber basis, and maybe, I actually thought this back in 2018 when we were debating it in mass, me, Zerdos, and the rest of the crew. I bet if you looked at some type of analysis that was like reps over 80% of 1RM, that might be a more effective way of counting quote-unquote effective reps rather than just, the last 5 reps. That analysis has never been done, but it does comport with this specific sub-analysis, as well as the data that we see from Martin, for example. When people are training, and in his study, it was all between like an 8 to 12 RM. So on the leg press and leg extension, 1 to 2 RIR, 1 RIR on leg extension, 2 RIR on the leg press. We saw really similar hypertrophy in these individuals. So that means that they were all training on average probably in that 80 to 85% of 1RM range on these movements with that type of RIR going to failure. And 1 to 2 RIR didn't make a difference to failure. So what I think we can generally take home here is that you can have an inverse relationship between, between RPE and load, or a normal relationship between RIR and load. So as load goes up, RIR can also go up, meaning that if you're doing sets of 4 to 8, you could probably be at a 2 to 4 RIR, and those sets would still quote-unquote count. And the reason why that's relevant is I think that's a really useful tool to preserve performance and minimize discomfort in especially leg days. So for example, someone might look at this meta regression and go, listen, closer to failure, better. Broad principle, I'm on all about it without much nuance or detail. And they want to do, say, squats, leg press, and leg extension. And they take it to the house and they fail in like the 6 to 10 rep range on 3 sets of squats, and then do the same thing on 3 sets of leg press and 8 to 12 range, and then the same thing with like 12 to 20 reps on leg extension. They would probably get less volume because of the load reductions due to cumulative fatigue, experienced more DOMs and more intra-session fatigue than if they did something like, hey, I want to do 3 sets of 6 to 8 at a 2 to 3 RIR in squats, 3 sets of 8 to 12 at a 1 to 2 RIR in leg press, and then do 3 sets to failure on leg extension, but similar growth. And that might constrain what they could do in their next leg day, say 72 hours later, or maybe not even allow them to have a second leg day that week, or let alone 3, like someone may be able to do if they were to better distribute that stress and balance it with the stimulus. So it becomes an optimization game, and I think that's where it's really useful, to where you can take a highly complex motor pattern like a squat that has a higher safety demand, higher technical demands, and also is just better suited to lower discomfort when you're not going to failure and doing lower reps, even though the weight's heavy. So working with like your 8 RM, your 15 RM, and your 20 RM, and being 3 reps from failure, 2 reps from failure, or 1 to actually all the way to failure, 1 rep from failure to failure, I think that's a better way to get the same stimulus for less fatigue.
And just to clarify, when you were talking, big picture, closer to failure, better for growth, is the baked in assumption that that's equating for volume, generally speaking?
Yeah, that's the independent relationship of it. So, and I think, yeah, like it's a funny thing to say equating for other things. Like in the specific meta-analysis by Robinson, one of the ways that this can trip people up is there was no relationship between strength and proximity to failure. But you have to control for load because you're always closer to failure with 90% of 1RM than 70% of 1RM.
Yeah.
So this is one of those things that can only be done statistically, right?
Yeah.
So if you were to compare two protocols where someone's doing 90% of 1RM and 70% of 1RM and they're doing triples, you can do triples with both. But one's going to be at a 1 to 2 RIR or even potentially failure if you're doing multiple sets. The other one's going to be like at a 15 RIR. And then you go, well, oh, wow, better strength than 90% of 1RM group. But you don't know. Is it because of 90% of 1RM or is it because they were close to failure? And when you control for load, it actually has nothing to do with RIR.
Right.
At least is the best way as we can delineate it. Because if you took that same 70% group and they trained close to failure and did more volume, generally they would still get worse strength gains compared to the group training at 90%. So strength is heavily load dependent. So in the same way that it accounted for, quote unquote, or it was adjusted for load, it was also adjusted for volume.
Okay, cool. Makes sense. All right, Helms, good stuff. I think that probably wraps it up for this episode. We did have someone who commented, could you guys do more banter in the beginning of episodes? This is by Kappa. And Kappa has a history. I just want you to know, I believe that they listen to Front Page Fitness as well, which I host with the esteemed Dr. Lauren Colenso Semple. I'm pretty sure Kappa, if memory serves, has been known to make some sarcastic comments in the live chat over there. So unless I'm, please forgive me, Kappa, if this is a case of mistaken identity. My feeble mind certainly is going to some extent. But I'm very curious to see if that is a sarcastic comment or a genuine comment, because banter at the beginning of episodes is probably the most divisive element of this particular show, where some people would prefer a good 75 minutes of banter to kick things off. Other people would prefer a good 7.5 seconds of banter to kick things off.
Well, the iron culture tradition of when it was, Omar was leading the charge with me, was that the more people complained about the banter, the more banter we would do. So this Kappa could just be playing 3D chess and it's going, you know what? This is a serious comment that I want you to believe is a serious comment. And you might even think it's serious because I am one who banters and makes sarcastic comments. We see you, Kappa. But if I tell you to do more of it, based upon your response to you should be doing less of it and then doing more of it, reverse psychology, therefore you should do less of it, which is what I actually want. So this is not a sarcastic comment. This is a real comment from a sarcastic person who's trying to manipulate us. Therefore, I have no idea what we should do.
Did it actually work the other way? I understand that you guys would punish people who complained with more banter, but if people said, hey, I just want you to know I really appreciate the banter, it's been a really tough time in my personal life and this has really been cheering me up, would you then withdraw it from them?
No, I don't think he needs to play 3D chess with us. Basically, all that we did was whatever the hell we wanted always,
Yes.
and then pretended that we were appeasing our audience. So no, you're right. You're right.
I just want to make sure it was whether or not it was bi-directional, so everyone understands. But okay, so we will, in terms of banter, continue doing what we feel like doing. It sounds like that is the official policy. We did have someone call in a wellness check on Omar. They wanted to know how he's doing, so we need to get him back on one of these days.
I am actually going to be going to Toronto in a couple weeks, and I'll be hanging out with him. So maybe we'll actually even see if he will deign to be taken a picture of and allow me to post that on my social media.
Can you do like a surprise podcast episode that he doesn't know he's participating in, where you just like leave your phone running on record setting and just chat with him for a while, and we can just use that as an episode?
I need to check the legality of doing that in Canada.
Yeah.
And then if it's not legal to Canada, I'd be like, hey, let's take a quick trip across the Niagara Falls, check out New York, because I think you can in the States record people without their permission.
It depends on the state. There's some places where it's like a one party, which basically means you can do whatever you want. In some states, both parties must consent to be recorded via audio.
Well, can you double check on the sperm data as well as the privacy laws in New York? Because it's not really feasible for me to take him to any other location in the the short time span that I'll be
Yeah,
in
just
Toronto.
just ask him. Have you ever been to the lovely city that is Detroit? There are so many sites I want to show you, and then maybe Michigan's laws will be more forgiving. But I will look into all these things and more. Helms, thank you so much for an illuminating episode. You carried the rock, most of the load here with some hard hitting science. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions. By the way, thanks to everyone in the live chat who submitted questions as well. Again, Helms, double check me. It's massresearchreview.com/iron culture. That is the question submission portal, correct? I'm not forgetting any hyphens,
I actually don't know.
backslashes,
but
forward slashes. Okay,
you're gonna have to talk and fill some space while I check it, mate.
that's your job, because I want people to make sure that they don't miss out on the next round here. So in the meantime, I want to thank everyone in the live chat for being part of the show. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions. I'm watching Helms type with a single finger, very reminiscent of someone's grandfather pecking away at a digital keyboard. But in any case, we will be back next week with another live episode. I know Helms mentioned he's got a great interview lined up coming in the near future.
massresearchreview.com/iron culture. All one word.
All one word. Beautiful. Okay, we have confirmation. So, folks, that's where you send your questions. You can tell how long it's been since we actually told people to do that. So, shame on us. But everyone, take care. Have a fantastic week, and we will see you in 7 days with yet another episode.